Welcome everyone to this evening's seminar hosted by the Transnational Legal History Group, part of the Center for Comparative and Transnational Law here at CUHK Law. Our presenter this evening is Dr. Sakiko Kaiga, Associate Professor in the Graduate School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Hiroshima University in Japan. Professor Kaiga will speak this evening on the subject of her book, Britain and the Intellectual Origins of the League of Nations, 1914 to 1919, published by Cambridge University Press and winner, as you can see on the slide, of the 2023 Scott Bills Memorial Prize in Peace History awarded by the Peace History Society. In the book, Professor Kaiga explores in original detail the complex debates and dynamics among different individuals, primarily within Britain, but elsewhere as well, and individuals and groups over the course of the First World War and its aftermath that helped lead to the creation of the League of Nations. Of course, as I'm sure everyone or many know, the League of Nations as the predecessor organization to the United Nations. So she explores in detail the processes that led to the formation of that first important international organization that helped to explain the particular form that it took in various ways. And while we will hear, I'm sure, a fascinating portion of this story tonight, there is much more in the book itself, so I encourage everyone to go out, purchase a copy, read it thoroughly in its entirety as well. So Professor Kaiga will speak for around 50 minutes this evening. After that, we will open the floor to questions and answers in person and online, as we're mixed mode today. So if you have any questions, please feel free to, of course, in person, raise your hand, or online, send me a message in the chat, and I will read it out, or perhaps even unmute you, so you can ask it yourself. For everyone's information, tonight's lecture will be recorded and posted online after the event, so if you're interested in viewing it again or sharing it with friends and colleagues, you can find it on our social media pages. Without further ado, let me hand over the floor to Professor Kaiga.
Okay, thank you very much for your kind introduction, Chris, and thank you very much for having me. And thank you very much for coming, everyone here and also online. It seems to be many people, actually. If you've got questions, then just please ask me after the presentation. So I'm Sakiko Kaiga. I'm a historian of international relations, and now I'm teaching at Hiroshima University in Japan. So I want to talk about my book today, which is titled Britain and the Intellectual Origins of the League of Nations, 1914 to 19. And as you can see, so it's been published, but it was in 2021, so it's quite a while ago, actually. But still, well, it's really nice to talk to people I usually can't see, so thank you very much again for coming. So I'm now moving on to the 1920s and 30s, but still looking at the League of Nations. If you also have questions about, well, what's happening after this, that would also be nice. Okay. Okay, so this is, so I'm going to talk about my book. I want to specifically talk about the final chapter of my book, which is chapter 5. It's entitled Peace Without Victory, The League of Victorious Allies, 1917 to 18. So this is, my book is mostly about the Britain and during the First World War and how the League of Nations was created and how it was planned and promoted and actually got created after the war. So as you can see, so 1917 to 18, so this is really the last, the final year, 1 year of the First World War. And this title, as you can see, many people probably know, President Wilson, he was an American president at the time, and he made a speech titled "Peace Without Victory." So I added "no" to describe the situation. So I put the title like "No Peace Without Victory." Okay, so this is outline, but I just go one by one, so don't worry about it. So I will talk about this League of Nations Society is the main body of the League of Nations movement, and in Britain, but they actually had a lot of problem at the end of the war. So I want to talk about what was happening at the end of the war in Britain. Okay. Introduction, first of all. So what is this League of Nations movement, which I've been talking about in my book? So this is the timeline to remind you what was happening at the time. So the First World War started in 1914 and ended, the armistice was in 1918. And then the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, and there many leading politicians got together and discussed to create the League of Nations after the war. This League of Nations was the first international organization for peace, and that became the predecessor of the United Nations as we have now. So many historians and scholars, when they talk about the creation of the League of Nations, mostly looking at this Paris Peace Conference, because that was the time and the place that many people, politicians came together and discussed about the possible international organization and actually decided to create the League of Nations. So it's fair to see this conference itself, but this idea of this League of Nations itself was actually invented and also prepared and promoted by this League of Nations movement, which was quite big in Britain and also United States. Actually, so I have one chapter, I think chapter 4 in my book, which talks about British and also American groups and how they communicated and collaborated and also disagreed with each other. So if you have a question about this American side, that would also be nice. So this League of Nations movement in Britain was led by a liberal internationalist. They are liberal intellectual, mostly university professor or journalists and some politicians. So they started this League of Nations movement right after the war started in 1914. Started discussing about the possible international organization after the war. So their idea really provided the basic framework of the current international system to prevent war, such as collective security. So today's question, especially, is about this idea of a possible organization that became quite famous and also quite popular at the end of the war. But I want to discuss where does this final big push to create a League of Nations actually come from? In previous research about this, the creation of the League of Nations has been, well, as I said, mostly discussed from this perspective of the Paris Peace Conference. And then historians, scholars mostly looked at this League of Nations movement, just pacifists. They just didn't quite understand the politics, but just dreaming for peace. But they somehow become sort of popular because the war lasted so long, 4 years, and people just wanted peace. And there was a strong war awareness at the end of the war, especially. And now warrism came in and started talking about the League of Nations. So why not create the League of Nations? So that is kind of very simple, straightforward story has been told. But then my book and also today's paper want to show this movement was, first of all, it was not pacifist movement. Because if you look at what they've been discussing as the post-war order, you can see they actually changed their legal nation idea by reflecting the public expectation. But this public expectation was not for peace. So this movement, legal nation movement, changed their legal nation's idea by reflecting the public's expectation for the exclusion of Germany. So this change of the post-war plan by the legal nation movement was the key point that I want to make today. Then just to show briefly how the idea changed during the war. So when the war started in 1914, so I can't really talk much about the 1914 today, but if you also have a question about how this idea began and received in 1914, that sort of question is also welcome. But this idea in 1914 was, first of all, the legal nation activists identified rivalry of alliance blocks as the cause of the war. So the great powers divided into two, they compete each other. That was the cause of the war. So the solution is to create a new international organization that includes all the great powers. But as I will talk about today, by the end of the war in 1918, the League of Nations activists actually came to promote what they had originally opposed in 1914, which was the League of Nations should be a continuation of the wartime alliance against Germany. So this change of their post-war idea was actually very important to explain how they got the final push for the creation of the League of Nations in Britain. So why they changed their idea? So giving you an answer, and I of course am explaining a bit more in the body part, but why they changed the League of Nations idea? Because the simple answer is, people want it. But it's not just the public, but politicians, many journalists, like the newspapers, the church, and even the League of Nations activists, by the end of the war, actually just wanted to defeat Germany and punish Germany. And the League should be created, but only as an extension of waging the war against Germany. So this led to an increase in the popularity of the League of Nations movement in Britain. And at the same time, as you can see, this marks the end of the original vision of the League of Nations. So before going to the body part, I just want to suggest something, because it's really a good example to think about this, because so I would say, however long and exhausting the war have become, this experience of war doesn't really necessarily generate the popular desire for peace that translates directly into the public support for a peaceful organization. So people quite often say, oh, this war lasted so long, it was terrible, then people just want peace. But in practice, actually, it doesn't always get connected to this idea that the people want to make a very peaceful organization and peaceful society and a lasting peace. And I think it's also really a good example if you think about this case at the end of the war. Okay, so that was the introduction. I want to go into the body parts. So first of all, I want to look at this League of Nations Society, which as I mentioned, that was the main body of the League of Nations movement. But in 1918, these League of Nations Society members were divided on the question whether Germany should be excluded from a new organization or not. Also, that is the pamphlet and the newsletter they've been issuing during the war. So there are some people who argued Germany should be inside the League of Nations. And it was particularly argued by some original member of the League of Nations Society, such as Lord Dickinson. He was a Cambridge classicist, and Willoughby Dickinson is this man. He was a Liberal MP, and also he was a peace campaigner. So for them, why war happened? Why the war happened? Because of the rivalry of alliance blocks. For them, so the solution is to create a new organization that includes all the great powers. So they still have this original idea that League of Nations should include all at least the great powers. So because they thought if the League of Nations exclude Germany, then the organization would be just like nothing more than the perpetuation of the great power divide. So that still has the primary cause of war. Then there are also some other people who argue that Germany should be outside the League of Nations. They even created this League of Nations Society and created a new group called the League of Free Nations Association. And it was founded by some people, including David Davis, and he was very rich Liberal MP. And also another example would be H.G. Wells. He was also a famous novelist in Britain. So for them, the war happened because of the German aggression and its militarism. So for them, it's Germany's fault, it's Germany's responsibility. So Germans are not qualified to be admitted into the League of Nations. So I think some people might be intrigued with this word, these free nations, and they actually explained it as a sort of democratic states. So they said free nation means one which believes in and practices representative government and whose executive ministers are responsible for their action to the elected representatives of the people. But they came up with these free nations to promote this idea of the League of Nations that would exclude Germany. So they just used these free nations to, do the effective propaganda work. So if you got this condition of free nation, Germany might be admitted if the country become democratic. But they also said, oh, but there's no immediate prospect. So this League of Free Nations Association argues they should transform and consolidate the present alliance into a permanent League of Free People at once. So some of you might be thinking, oh, there might be some connection with the British government and the new group. And the answer is yes and no. So let me explain it. So David Davis, this leader of this new group, had this new Free Nations Association, along with the enemy propaganda department under the newspaper magnate Lord Northcliffe, this guy, at Crew House. And that was established in 1918. So this Northcliffe owned a lot of newspaper at the time. So this propaganda department was also called just like Crew House. So this Crew House tried to transmit British propaganda to neutral and enemy countries. And they thought this idea of League of Free Nations in propaganda to Germany might effectively threaten the Germans with this exclusion from post-war order if they continue the war. And this crew house and also the new group actually wanted blame for the original member of the League of Nations Society, that they said they're just like they're taking the pacifistic argument. It's not strong enough. So they really try to criticize the pacifistic argument they said the League of Nations Society are keeping. Sorry. Yeah, that's it. But actually, so this policy of crew house was not really directed by the British government, because if you read their paper, you can see this member of the crew house said they actually did not have a clear and agreed peace policy as a department. And they actually did not have close contact with the Foreign Office either, because David Davis, the leader of this new group, often asked the Foreign Office, Foreign Office about their policy regarding the League of Nations, but didn't really get the answer. And also H.G. Wells, this guy, said they actually got nothing about this League of Nations idea got from the Foreign Office. So what was happening here, I think it could probably be explained in this way. So it's true that the British government was engaged in this campaign to sustain civil war in 1917 to 18. But as historian John Horn pointed out, it was not the simple model of state versus society. So this remobilization of support for the war involved a lot of voluntary participation of semi-official and private agencies, such as this department or this new group. They supported this cause of fighting on until Germany was defeated. So now we have two League of Nations groups, League of Nations Society, this new League of Free Nations Association. And these two groups work separately and recruited members during the summer of 1918. However, they actually began to negotiate amalgamation only within 1 month of the association formation. And they agreed a common platform, including the immediate formation of the League of Nations among the allies, which means they adopted new group's idea that the League of Nations should exclude Germany. And they got reunited into the League of Nations Union in October 1918, which was 1 month before the armistice. So what was happening? I mean, they hated each other, disagreed a lot. They, even quitted the group, and there were two groups, and they really, in a way, they were competing. But they just got reunited so soon. So why they amalgamate so quickly is the next question we now come to. Okay, why these two groups got reunited so fast? The overriding and the major reason was that the majority opinion in Britain at this time favored the exclusion of Germany. And by August 1918, the society leader had learned that the opinion outside the political circle did not favor the inclusion of Germany at all. So during the final year, 1918, the newspaper quite often featured this question of German admission into the League, but the majority opinion was decidedly against the German inclusion. For example, this one is from the Observer, I quote, German militarism must disappear. It will not disappear unless it is totally beaten in the field. To preserve themselves and to promote more effective action for the larger purpose, the Allies must form their own league, making it as solid and comprehensive as possible. And another example, this is a diary entry of Kate Courtney. She was a social worker and also the wife of the Liberal MP Courtney. And this is actually after the armistice, but still captured the anti-German sentiment and was quite strong in Britain, even after the armistice. So I quote, yesterday, I took out the banner I have been embroidering, large blue silk one with a dove in the center and olive branch, to ask if they would like to put them on their many flag from the town hall. I went today and was told by the town clerk that they thought it's wholly unsuitable. You have put an olive branch in, and we are not ready to offer Germany the olive branch. We are not pro-Germans here. So, in 1918, many actors in Britain thought League of Nations should be created, but the League should be just like the continuation of the wartime alliance against Germany. And the prevalence of this view compels the leadership of the League of Nations Society to shift its stance and get reunited with the association very quickly. Okay, but then why so many people just wanted to exclude Germany? There are several reasons, but I just go one by one. The most obvious and, of course, fundamental reason was victory. So people thought they are fighting for victory and fighting until the Allied victory. So League can be created, but only as a result of the Allied victory. So Edward Grey, he was a former foreign secretary, and he actually became the president of this reunited League of Nations Union. And at their first meeting, Grey, for example, said the League of Nations cannot be a substitute for a successful termination of this war. It must arise out of the successful termination, which is victory. And many people also thought they're not just fighting for victory, but also for something higher. And they quite often say they're also fighting for abolishing militarism. And they also quite often say, destroy Prussian militarism. And they use these phrases almost like equivalent. So they need to win the war, defeat Germany, and Germany had to be punished after the war. So that comes as a whole set. So this argument has been actually repeated in many phrases, like a newspaper. For example, these are both from the Times. So the League provided no room for Kaiser-ridden Germany, represented by triumphant military and naval figure. Or it's plainly impossible to admit Germany to a League of Peace until she has given proof of complete regeneration. So now probably you can see this logic of supporting the League of Nations was almost the same as that of supporting the war, which was Britain needed to fight to vanquish Germany and its militarism. So in 1918, many politicians also started talking about the League of Nations. There is a League of Nations should be something like the organization of the civilized, peace-loving states, which will be founded in Christian doctrine and brotherhood, all these things. But they also started to stress something as an important condition for the creation of the League of Nations, that was the country was democratic or not. So this man was Philip Carr. He was a private secretary of the Prime Minister Lloyd George. He, for example, described like this: after the Russian Revolution and the American entry into the war in 1917, he said the character of the war became more ideological. So the war became not simply for the liberation of Belgium. That was the case at the beginning of the war in Britain, for example. But the war has taken on openly the character of war democracy versus autocracy. So many politicians in Britain started talking about this democracy as an important condition of the League of Nations because they thought the League of Nations should offer not only the short-term solution, but should also offer a long-term solution to this problem of the war. Because the war lasted so long, well, enormous casualty, they just needed to justify the fight as well as enormous sacrifices. So they came up with this idea of putting and stressing democracy as an important condition of the League of Nations. And they started looking at the organization of democratic states should be the idea of the League of Nations. In that case, if you put that condition to the creation of the League of Nations, Germany could not enter unless the country was defeated and transformed into a democracy. So again, Philip Carr, this is a letter to the Prime Minister Lloyd George. He said, I quote, I am a League of Nations man, but the League which had succeeded in defending right and defeating wrong in this war. This is in truth a war against war, but that can only be attained through victory for our cause, which he meant democracy. So the same or similar idea has been also stressed by other leading politicians. For example, this is Jan Smuts. He was a South African general and also member of the British Imperial War Cabinet. And he said, I quote, "We could not make peace while Germany sat with the fruits of her sin. She's planned this deed of shame against Europe. She schemed in the dark and prepared. Germany must realize that these things must not be." Again, Edward Grey, also in the first meeting of the League of Nations Union, he said, I quote, "You can trust no government which does not come to you with the credential that it exists with the confidence of the people behind it, and responsible to that people and to no one else." So you can see this wide support for the League of Nations in Britain did not necessarily actually come from their people's craving for peace, but was heavily conditioned on the Allies' victory and the abolition of militarism. So in 1918, many people actually recasting the war as an ideological struggle of democracy versus militarism, or moral crusade, right versus wrong, or justice versus injustice. And attaching these conditions to the creation of the League of Nations, of course, had a strong impact on the League of Nations movement itself. So now for the final section, I want to go back to the League of Nations movement itself. So as we saw, there were now two groups League of Nations Society and League of Free Nation Association, they got reunited and made one big group, League of Nations Union, in October 1918. And this League of Nations Union adopted this idea that League should exclude Germany. So that was really the final break with the original idea of the League of Nations that would include at least all the great powers. So when the war started originally in 1914, these League of Nations activists identified the alliance system as the primary cause of war. So that was the system. It's not the German responsibility, actually, or German aggression or militarism that caused war in their idea. So they wanted to replace the system with a new international organization. And also, these activists actually began this movement as a sort of counter to the anti-German sentiment in Britain in 1914. But in 1918, League of Nations movement adopted more militant vision of the League of Nations as a continuation of the wartime alliance. And after the war in the League of Nations, probably many people know about this, the League of Nations, when it was created, excluded Germany from its membership. Initially, Germany was admitted in the late 1920s, but initially they were excluded from the membership. And that seems like it buttressed the structure to enforce incoming member to have desirable quality. But that was also quite ambiguous because the League of Nations Covenant, for example, just stipulated that, for example, any self-governing states might be a member, and it says, oh, just provided that it shall give effective guarantee of its sincere intention to observe in its international obligation and shall accept such regulation as may be prescribed by the League. But then, by the end of the war, many League of Nations activists now actually adopted this idea the League should exclude the Germany and its allies. And probably just almost like only one who didn't like this idea until the end, who was Lord Dickinson, this guy. He was the Cambridge classicist, and he was one of the very initiator of the League of Nations idea. After the war began in 1914, he was the one who came up with this idea to create the League of Nations and started to have small study circle or to discuss the possible League of Nations plan. So he really began this movement in 1914. So Dickinson warned against the movements deviating from original aim to change the norms of IR. I mean, so as I mentioned, so originally, League of Nations activists wanted to change the norm, change the structure of the international society, but now they are not doing it. So Dickinson criticized this new group's anti-German claim for hindering German people from fostering the right thinking for future peace. So Dickinson still believed unless the League of Nations included all the major powers, it would produce a great repeat of the unregulated great power competition of the pre-1914 years. But then, this new League of Nations Union now adopted and promoted this idea that Germany would be excluded from the organization. And he was definitely the minority. So he was quite depressed and wrote this letter to one of his friends. But this is a bit long quote, but this is really showing that the situation and also capture what was it like in 1918 and also some sort of implication to the post-war international society. So I want to quote this before I'm going to conclusion. So a kind of despair comes over me as I realize how the event of the last 5 years have made it almost impossible for the governments of people at war with Germany to believe in or understand that spirit. The orgy of suspicion and contempt and hate, the mere determination to trample on the man that is down, which occupies our whole press and even apparently the mind of our statesmen. It's terrible at the moment which will determine the whole future of mankind. Okay, conclusion, well, to sum up, so the League of Nations was established as the League of Nations activists wanted. So this movement succeeded in bringing public attention to the post-war idea and also making it one of the critical political issues. So it seems all the success, but that came with this promotion of the League of Nations idea that they had originally opposed in 1914. That was the League of Victorious Allies against Germany. So 1914 to 15, the League of Nations movement began as a reaction against anti-German jingoism, and they thought not German aggression, but international system as the cause of the war. But by the end of the war, 1918, this newly united League of Nations Union promoted the League of Nations as a continuation of the wartime alliance. So behind this, and there was a strong self-mobilization of civil society to fight until victory. So the League of Nations, many people thought, should be formed, but only as a coalition of democratic states after the Allied victory. Because in their idea, this militaristic authoritarian Germany was responsible for the war. So Germany could not be a League member until the country learned to adhere to the civilized value of a democratic nation. So finally, I want to add like a significance. I think so many historians and scholars look at 1918 and say, oh, so many people are talking about the League of Nations, and they're actually talking about quite different things. Like a variety of League of Nations plan existed by various League of activists. But as you can see, if you really look at what they were talking about in 1918, there's ultimately only one vision of the League that people both inside and outside the pro-League circle wanted, which was the League of Victorious Free Allies. And finally, in a more sort of long-term significant, I think the change of the League of Nations activists and their idea reflected a long-term transformation in international history from more 19th century diplomacy of the concerted European great powers type of politics to the 20th century more ideological and polarized international politics, which became more visible in the Second World War and Cold War. Okay, so that's it. So thank you very much for listening.
So thank you so much, Sakiko, for the fantastic presentation. So I will remind everyone in person and online, please, if you have any questions, start thinking about them. Feel free to send over to me. I know online it's always hard to formulate. Personally, I find it hard to formulate a question in text. So if you would like to raise your hand, well, probably send me a message in the chat and perhaps I can unmute you as well. But I have, yes, okay, so I see one in the audience. I'll start with one of my questions and then I have probably more questions than we have time for, but so I'll limit myself to one and then hand over to others. Yeah, taking chair's prerogative to ask the first question. So one thing I find super interesting is, you were referencing Lord Northcliffe and Crew House and the enemy propaganda department. I guess for folks who don't know, it's sort of really that Northcliffe is the initial sort of propaganda bureau figure. This is the creation of sort of propaganda in a modern sense in the context of the First World War, so just sort of direct state control over kind of shaping narratives at a scale. Of course, there's precedence to that throughout history, but not at that scale. He was a newspaper magnate, and that kind of like mass popular press was relatively new for a few decades, relatively new as well. So there's something quite dramatic about all of that. And then what's interesting to me in a way, so I also know, especially, as you noted, this kind of an early First World War, and then there's the sort of things get more intense as the war goes on, right? And there's a change of government at the end of 1916, and in 1917 and 1918, there's also sort of emergency, the state becomes much more powerful. There's a lot of emergency governance in Britain in the First World War, and in 1917 and 1918, there's also a lot of labor activists and pacifists who are protesting the war, who are getting met with new repressive legislation, with prosecutions, with being beaten up potentially by vigilante groups connected to the propaganda department and so on. Bertrand Russell, the famous philosopher, is a prominent pacifist who ends up, I believe he's in prison for a while, but certainly, facing serious challenges from the state in the course of 1918. So in that context, right, so you have this, fascinating account of how the sort of what it is that's being pushed for in terms of a new international organization after the war, what that looks like and how that shifts as the war goes on. But then just to note, to the sort of the story you're telling about what happens in 1918 in particular, as you said, it doesn't seem like there's, the government as a whole is unified behind reshaping the narrative, but the enemy propaganda department certainly seems to want it reshaped in a certain way and to more or less get what it wants. And at the same time, they're sort of prosecuting the more idealist sort of pacifists who are sort of anti-war in general and maybe still have some of that, resistance to just rendering Germans as an absolute like enemy, category. So all of that is, that sort of a context for everyone as well. But so the question is sort of how do you think those state actions in that period played, is your sense that they played a pretty effective role in the story that you're telling, sort of the reshaping of the idea of what the League of Nations might look like in that post-war period, or do you think it was more, say that the members of those groups actually they themselves were sort of internally reconfiguring their notions, or what do you think?
Yeah. I think the activists internally figuring rather than state means the government. Well, of course they were trying to to manipulate the propaganda and how this League of Nations idea can be used actually for their purpose, but it's more. I think it's more about this activist part, and also this new activists, this new group, the League of Nations Free Association, and connected to the Crew House and these propaganda people at Northcliffe. They're really trying to take over this argument of the League of Nations and trying to shift it to the more anti-German and argument, and just portraying Germany as a country, the country actually, but who was responsible for this war.
Just to follow up on that, so were the League of Free Nations Association folks part of the pro League of Nations movement previously as well, and they just sort of shifted their position on what it should be, or were they joining that movement just with a new perspective on?
Oh yes, that's a good question. Thank you. These people who organized the new group came relatively later. So as I mentioned, some League of Nations Society member, such as these two Dickinsons, oh, okay, that's a bit. They really were in the group from the beginning, 1914. But then this League of Nations idea became popular and people started talking about it after the around 1917, especially after the American entry into the war. And then after many more people became interested in the idea and they became more active in the movement, and like David Davies and also other people who started to create a new organization came after 1917. I think they were interested in the idea, but they were not the sort of main core member of the League of Nations movement.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I think we had, one question. Do we have a microphone we can bring to a member of the audience?
Thank you. So my question is, how much of a role do you think the initial exclusion or marginalization of Germany, in the League of Nations, contributed to the post-war chaos in Germany and other states that were affected during the war? And why do you think, later on into the 1920s and the 1930s, that there were more states that eventually joined and
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, exactly. I think that was really the beginning of this chaos in 1930, as you mentioned, in Germany especially. Germany just were excluded from this organization, and really, League of Nations was made as something really, against Germany in a way, as I discussed today. So that really was the beginning of this, also interwar sort of crisis, and also that became really the beginning of the Second World War.
Can I follow? So, what do you think changed in the 1920s, in the way that in the way that they operated, that allowed Germany and other states that they, I think, first deemed to be, non-democratic states, right, to join the League of Nations?
Sorry. So when Germany.
I think they joined in the middle of the 1920s, right? So,
right.
What changed in their perceptions that they, allowed Germany to join?
So I'm not sure they were talking. Thank you very much. That's a good question. Actually, so they were talking about this democratic country, but of course, I don't think they actually agreed about what this democratic states meant when the League of Nations was created. So that was a bit ambiguous part. And also, when the League of Nations created, so they had this idea, that should be the organization of democratic states. But it doesn't mean that the League of Nations was created as the organization of democratic states only. So there was always this ideal, and also in the practice, there's a sort of the gap between what they were doing and the saying. And when of course, the things were quite different. America didn't join, and they wanted to look League of Nations as something not like this organization against Germany. But in 1920s, after the League of Nations started operating, they thought, of course, they want to look like the international organization. And for that purpose, they wanted to have Germany at some point. So that happened, but also it wasn't quite immediate. So have to do a lot of political talks and diplomacy, and also have to change the argument of what this democracy actually meant. So.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So my question is: do you think that it is not the alliance itself that need the German in reaching the peace, but they need the German consent in not initiating another war that allows the world reach to the peace?
Sorry, can I explain that?
Sorry. Do you think it is not the alliance itself that need German to reach the peace, but they need the German consent or agreement in not initiating another war that lead the world to the peace.
So
So it is.
they should have needed German consent at more like cooperation.
Yes.
Yeah. That's more. I think it's more, you're more reasonable.
That's the point.
I think it's really right thinking, but yeah, at this point, it's just the argument they try to uphold and also promote was that all Germany should be excluded. But of course, if you think about the, this right line of thinking, of course, this what Dickinson at the end of the presentation said was more reasonable and probably the right way to go.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Professor Kaiga. The way I look at it, right, as you tell the gradual changes, right, it looks like they gradually find the equilibrium. Should they not include Germany? There will be continuous struggling, difficulty, debate. It appears to me they eventually find the best solution. What do you think?
So, sorry, including Germany.
Yeah.
It's also
although with a condition or whatever, I mean.
It's also quite unstable.
I think this is the most appropriate solution. What do you think?
Including Germany.
Yes, including Germany.
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
I mean, if it is not the solution, they will continue to struggle. Whatever parties, I mean, they will continue to struggle, debate, and this is the only solution they can reach, right? And this is the okay. Good.
Maybe so actually following up, two little follow-ups on the questions that have been asked. So one, just so you, I guess both substantively and then also methodologically, you didn't mention Keynes in your presentation, who's sort of famous for when the League is being debated for worrying about the economic exclusion of Germany in particular and the consequences of that in a way that seems to parallel the presentation that you made, right? With him being on the side of the sort of pure pacifists, inclusionists, or what they call them. So, so what do you think about Keynes sort of substantively and how he fits into all this? And then also, is it just like a timeline thing, or did you see that as a slightly separate question, or is it maybe it's in the book but it wasn't in your presentation, or just kind of like what you think about that side of things?
Economic consequences.
Yeah. So did you do you see that as kind of the same debate happening in the same sort of debate you've been talking about today, just in the context of the actual negotiations over the League, or do you see it as a slightly different type of debate?
I think that was pretty much the same line of discussion going on altogether. It's my
yeah. I mean, it feels very similar, just with an emphasis on sort of the economic unification is economic relationships are important for peace rather than strictly identitarian. Yeah. The other, I mean, it's sort of the other, maybe beyond the scope of your presentation in the book, but on the question of Germany, there's probably also an issue around sort of broader the Soviet Union at that point in time in the mid-20s and kind of international politics and worries about how like Germany's position in the big picture maybe changes a little bit. But actually another question I wanted to ask about the sort of democratization heading that you mentioned was, so as you noted in the presentation, right, it seems in part sort of it's just a propaganda, like this is our way of excluding Germany and that's what we want. And then it's also a propaganda in the sense that, I think as you noted as well, sort of by the end of the war, the government needs to justify all of the fighting, all of the conscription, all of the mass death of the British population, and so on. And then there's also, of course, the other interesting thing in the context of democracy is that it's in 1918 itself that the Representation of the People Act is passed in the UK, which is when the vote is extended to the poorest 40 or so % of the male population and to women for the first time, sort of wealthier women over 30, but still for the first time. So there's sort of this, it's sort of the first time it's probably the most dramatic single act extending the franchise within Britain, right? Which is not a coincidence that that's happening, I think, in the last year of the war, where they feel the need to, to give the population something in the context of all the suffering. So the sort of emphasis, but then, okay, so there's a lot of different propaganda reasons, maybe. On the external side, it's not, it's okay, you can sort of, I guess my question is more, so you can say we're excluding Germany because they're not democratic enough, but that, in the context of Britain in 1918, I guess I wonder whether when they were arguing along those lines, were they also thinking about empire and the growing emphasis on self-determination, and the fact that they, if you think about Britain not only in terms of England, Scotland, and Wales, but the whole British Empire, emphasizing like the League as a place for democracy might have, sort of anti-imperial implications as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's good point, and a lot of contradiction, also I mentioned in the answer. But then this, say, democracy, and as you mentioned this, inside domestic politics, of course, probably going to the more sort of democratic direction inside Britain. But then, of course, they have empire. They didn't really think it's something they are going to lose at some point. They're still having this empire as the base of the politics, and also if you think about when the League of Nations created, it's, of course, as I mentioned, it's not only for the democratic countries, and so they're talking about this democracy, but they still justifies empire, and also included country like for example Japan became one of the great power, became the founding member of the League of Nations, but was not democratic in that sense inside, if you think about domestic politics. So it's really a lot of contradiction, and they really speaking in sort of with a lot of different meaning with using this word of democracy, and also this trying to justify the fight and the war and bring up this idea of democracy, but at the same time the thing's not really dramatically changed if you think about the power politics and empire and the stuff.
Did you sort of did you, in the files you were looking at from the different League of Nations groups, did you see them, were they talking about colonialism at all, or it just wasn't on their radar, or was that subject coming up?
There are, for example, in the context of Britain, there are people called a round table group. They are basically, the supporter of the empire, British Empire. So they are actually talking about this League of Nations, and they like the idea. But then for them, this League of Nations should be just like the British Empire. So it's British Empire really the good model. And when the League was created, and then they said, oh, that should be more like the British Empire, because that is a successful model to run the country and make a stable society. So that is also something very interesting.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. Also, I think from sort of looking at just having come off a project looking at early League of Nations related and ILO related files from the 1920s, British officials are entirely within it's British colonial officials are very powerful within those organizations, and they are trying to do things very much along the British imperial model. So very interesting. So and in that context, I mean, another thing I wondered about was so it's sort of within the context of the, so another, I mean, I wonder what you think about this, which is sort of another perspective on the same thing, is within the course of the First World War, you know, one could see it as the big historical moment where the United States sort of kind of becomes the dominant partner in relationship to Britain. Like Britain is the global hegemon up until X point in historical time, and the United States takes over, and sort of in the First World War, it feels, you know, it's typically identified as, I think, you know, you could, depending on what you look at, you could take different places, but the United States is kind of becoming this senior partner. So what do you think about, right, so one way of looking at it is, okay, we sort of want to, certain communities in Britain want to exclude Germany out of animosity to Germany because it sort of provides a particular justification to Britain, but also, you know, maintaining the alliance is a way of kind of trying to keep the US, like sort of the US closely on side and bring them in, you know, sort of create a new world order that will perpetuate British power, even though they know it's going to be diminished after the war. Of course, it doesn't maybe work out exactly that way, but what do you think about, yeah, kind of from that side of things?
So these League of Nations activists and also many British politicians were really anxious to have states from the beginning. So their idea was really, well, they basically knew that the British Empire can't do everything by this time. So their idea is to create a League of Nations. Then they also wanted America to be in, so that it's not going to be like, you know, this concert Europe type of politics. America can join, and then they thought it's easier for the British Empire to navigate after the war. So it's really key. So they really trying to get an American, you know, commitment and support for this League of Nations idea. But then, good point. Maybe this alliance thing might be connected to the America. As you said, I didn't really actually think about it, but there might be something they probably in their idea, just, you know, keeping this alliance. Then, because I don't think they didn't. I don't think they. But I mean, America was just, you know, the collaborator with the allies. So I guess at this time probably the League of Nations created, and then America would join. That was the premise for them. So, but probably they had this idea. Maybe the allies, then America can join easier. But I don't know. It's interesting.
Okay. One other, sort of for more on the methodological side, and the sort of like background process side. Another question I had is sort of, well, I guess sort of when did you first formulate that this was a issue area, a question you would be particularly interested in looking at? Like just the you know, focusing on the formation of the League of Nations in particular, what was it that got you interested in that theme initially? And as you were sort of, in terms of all the various archival materials you looked at and so on, what was sort of most, were there any things that were particularly like major moments for you, or was it kind of a gradual construction of a story? Were there any sort of particularly interesting underlying primary sources that you saw?
Like this how this story unfolded.
Yeah, I mean, both, I guess I'm asking about how, you know, for any sort of one who's in the audience who's thinking about doing legal history work, or just history work in general, sort of to talk a little bit about the process, kind of how you got interested in this question. And...
You're asking a personal question.
Yes,
no?
yeah.
So why I started this research is actually I mentioned a bit in acknowledgement, but then I actually started this research because of the 9/11. Probably you was a teenager, right? Then I was a teenager. Then I grew up in a country where Japan, of course, that still have Article 9, for example. And then if you grew up in Japan, you were actually in classroom and in education and society, you are told, oh, you're not going to support war under any circumstances. But then after 9/11, what happened in Japan was actually, well, as a teenager, I saw this media, and no one actually denied any military force were used for some purpose by mostly American and also the British military. But then I thought, okay, well, we around this, and in the society we were told that oh, they're not going to support war, but actually it's not always like that. But then, well, so it's not really like the principle that you should support. And then I started looking at, okay, then why and when war began to be regulated and illegalized, and that was after this League of Nations was created in the League of Nations Covenant. So I started looking at the League of Nations, and this League of Nations idea actually were prepared by this League of Nations activists. So I started looking at their paper, but then actually we turned up, like, this is excluding Germany and sort of story. It wasn't really something I've been thinking about. It's something I just gradually found out as I read the papers.
So thank you for interesting talks. So I want to ask about, apart from the opposition from all the great power doesn't want the Germany join the Union. So was the least failure to define a clear and enforceable pathway to the universal memberships, especially for Germany, is a fatal mistake from the start? Thank you.
Sorry, so they should have some sort of roadmap to have Germany in due course. Is that what you think?
Yes, should the leagues provide a clear definition about the memberships rather than just put the political consideration beyond on the other factors?
Yeah, thank you very much. Good point. Actually, so membership, as I mentioned a bit, it's really ambiguous. It's really something they just have to, after the League of Nations was created, they just have to find out what they're going to do with this admission, membership admission. But I guess something I noticed by reading the paper was this, because this League of Nations just didn't exist. Now we have United Nations, but there's nothing of the kind. But so when they created the League of Nations, they actually didn't know what to do. They just create something, and then they have to really decide afterwards. Then after the League of Nations created, the many countries started applying for the membership. But because that was the first organization, they just have to take many countries, because in a way, this is an international organization, but if there are not enough members, then it just doesn't sound good, right? It's not legitimate. So they want it to be sort of international legitimate organization. Then in that case, they just have to see what will happen, and try to have more country as the countries try to approach it and join the organization. So I think it seems like a lot of ad hoc thing was kind of inevitable, but still, it's, as you say, it's really the important point. Maybe they should have some sort of more specific guideline and probably roadmap, especially for Germany, so that the Germany can enter after the war. I agree with that.
I also have another question, because I found an interesting point in your book. You mentioned about the Christian blessing upon a league without the Germany. So I'm wondering that what role did religions and the Christian play in the legitimate exclusionary or the punitive vision of the league?
So thank you very much. So I think I didn't mention, but actually the church was also quite a strong supporter for the League of Nations. But then they also really strongly supported for this idea of this League of Nations that exclude Germany. So in a way, in case of Britain, at least, the church also needed to be powerful in a way by supporting for the war, because everyone now, this fighting lasted for 4 years, and then they wanted to have some sort of peace, but then when people want to have the League of Nations, but only for excluding Germany. In that case, church also tried to support that idea. So that was also the point I write a bit about it in that final chapter, but didn't mention in today's presentation. That is also quite a good point.
Thank you.
Okay. We've had quite a number of questions for our speaker. Not seeing any further questions in the chat. I think we can come to a conclusion at this point. So it just remains for me to thank Professor Kaiga for her really fascinating talk on, such a crucial moment in history with so many, I think, ongoing sort of ramifications and kind of interesting implications to, in relationship, a historical story, but with important implications relative to world events on an ongoing basis. So those in person, I guess, can join me in a round of applause.